The trial is far from over. The sentencing phase began on Wednesday, and it's expected to last for about 4 weeks of time. This is an important period as the 2 months that preceded the verdict. During this time, more evidence is presented to support the defense arguments, and more than 20 witnesses will be testifying for the defense team. I'm assuming that's not a cell phone. The aiding the enemy charge has been dropped, but there is no minimum sentence dictated for the 20 other charges. In the words of Mr. Coombs, David Coombs, the late defense attorney, we won the battle, but the war is not over. Today, we are honored to have with us guests who have been following the Bradley Manning case from the beginning, and will shed the light on this historical trial. I'm honored to introduce to you our panelists for this evening. Mr. Chris Hedges is the author of War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. He served as a war correspondent for the New York Times for 15 years. His writing now appears on Truth. He recently sued the Obama administration of the constitutionality of new detention powers in the National Defense Authorization Act. Professor Cornel is the class of 1943 Professor of African American Studies at Princeton and Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He's an acclaimed author, academic, polemicist who speaks largely on matters of race, class, and injustice in America. I'm honored also to introduce Nathan Fuller. Nathan is a New Jersey-based writer, editor, and activist. He studied documentary film and journalism at the College of New Jersey, where he edited a political news magazine. Nathan has been involved with the Bradley Manning Support Network for a very long time, and also he has been attending the court-martial every day, writing live reports of the proceedings from the media center. So.
On the legal aspects of this all afterward, if you like. For those who don't know, Bradley Manning is a 25-year-old Army intelligence analyst. He joined the Army when he was 19, deployed to Iraq in 2009, and within a few short months he witnessed scores of abuses that he realized his own work made him an accomplice to, and he couldn't abide by that. And so he released hundreds of thousands of documents to WikiLeaks, knowing that it could put the rest of his life on the line, and he felt it was worth it anyway. Charged with 22 offenses initially, some with extremely broad theories and some with unprecedentedly broad theories, Bradley pled guilty to 10 of those. He took responsibility for giving documents to WikiLeaks, and that plea would have put him in jail for up to 20 years. But that wasn't enough for the U.S. government, who decided to spend 5 weeks attempting to equate whistleblowing with spying, and tried to crush Bradley's spirit and his future, and the example that he set for holding the government accountable. The military convicted Bradley Manning on one count of Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for simply using wget. It's a program that just automates downloading of documents from the internet. Didn't give him any new access, but they decided that he was computer savvy, more so than his fellow soldiers, and that warranted 10 years in jail. Prosecutors attempted to use 8 and were successful with 6 counts of the Espionage Act, law so incredibly broad that they only had to show Manning should have reason to believe that the documents he released could have caused harm to the U.S. or aided its adversaries. Meanwhile, they failed to convince the judge who had otherwise sided with the government for nearly the entire case, that Bradley had aided the enemy. And that's why we're left with the potential 136 years in prison, tantamount to a life sentence, if he does get all of it, for merely hypothetical harm. That's what we're looking at. And it is merely hypothetical. We're now in the sentencing phase. Manning's defense is going to be able to show that Manning's releases did not cause harm to the United States, despite the fear-mongering rhetoric of all the highest people in power. People said he had blood on his hands, which leads was a terrorist organization, essentially, and that has not been borne out in court at all. And these are from prosecution witnesses. The government witnesses have failed to really confirm what they've been saying all along. We have Brigadier General Carr, who reviewed the war logs and sources identified therein, and said no deaths resulted from the release of these Iraq and Afghanistan war logs. We've had Ambassador Michael Kozak from the State Department. He reviewed the diplomatic cables and their release, and saw human rights and democracy activists named inside. And they spent months and months trying to relocate some of them, working with some of them, fearing that they might be in danger. He could not cite one that had been killed as a result of these releases. He was asked flat out by the government, what is the greatest damage? And he said a chilling effect, that some of these sources were now reluctant to talk to the U.S. in secret, afraid that they might have their secrets spilled. And so that's no real harm. But that's the neat trick that the government pulls. Block discussion of harm from the trial itself, secure 6 Espionage Act convictions, and then reveal that there was no real harm from these releases. And is that enough to send someone to prison for life? Hypothetical harm and a chilling effect? I think we should be looking at the chilling effect that Manning's conviction is going to have, and that this trial has had so far. Fellow soldiers and others who have classified information know that speaking up about these kind of secret atrocities, going to the press about human rights abuses, making that public and yet are covered up all the time, that's going to be prosecuted a lot more harshly than killing civilians and torturing detainees or starting aggressive wars. And so that's the kind of chilling effect that we really can't afford to let the military instill. And that's why we need to spend the next several weeks. It's going to be sentencing continuing, and then there's going to be a pretty immediate appeals. We're going to ask Jeffrey Buchanan, the Major General here in D.C., to do what he has the power to do, which is to reduce the sentence of someone convicted of espionage and yet tortured during his own detention. That should be enough on its face to overturn these convictions. And then from then on, this case will go up to the appeals court, Army appeals, Armed Forces appeals, and finally, if we must, we will demand President Obama pardon Bradley Manning. And so that's the fight ahead. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris Hedges.
First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be here with my good friend Cornel and with you in a city of bloodsuckers and criminals. Clearly in the one room that has all the patriots and honest men and women in Washington, or certainly most of them. And I think you shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the work that you've done has spooked and terrified the lynch squad that is going after Bradley Manning. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, and I've been on the ground. I've been on the receiving end of empire. And in my mind, the only opinion that counts on Bradley Manning is the opinion of the victims, the mothers in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen who have lost children. Ask them what they think of Bradley Manning. Bradley Manning is the best thing that has happened to this country since the invasion, the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, because by standing up, he showed that some of us have a conscience. The ability to stand up and name a crime, a war crime, as a crime, and then suffer the punishment that is being meted out for telling the truth. I don't think it's accidental that Cornel and I come out of the biblical tradition, both of us, because both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible were written by persecuted communities who understood the cost of being righteous. And in Bradley Manning, both of us saw the life and the action of a righteous human being who took upon himself, in the Christian metaphor, the cross, who picked up the cross and accepted the sacrifice with such courage and dignity and poise and intelligence. And I, like many of you, were sitting in that room when Bradley read that impressive statement in which he explained this historic act of conscience. As a journalist, what frightens me, terrifies me about what's happening in this country is that all capacity to shine a light on the inner workings of power are being systematically shut down, and Manning is a part of this process. When you put the pieces of this puzzle together, we are rapidly closing all space and becoming a frightening species of corporate totalitarianism, the Stasi state, and I covered the Stasi state as a correspondent on steroids.
Wow.
Barack Obama's assault on civil liberties is far more egregious than the assault of his predecessor, George W. Bush. The radical interpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving the executive branch the right to assassinate American citizens, the use of the FISA Amendment Act to retroactively make legal what under our Constitution was once illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, eavesdropping, and monitoring of tens of millions of Americans, and we now know because of Snowden, Edward Snowden's courageous release of evidence that it is virtually all of us being downloaded into supercomputers in Utah. And why was the FISA Amendment Act retroactive? Because when the telecommunications companies handed our personal information over to the government, there were a series of challenges in the lower courts which they knew they would lose, and so their lobbyists showed up with suitcases full of money to give them retroactive immunity. And Barack Obama supported the FISA Amendment Act. He had been elected president but had not yet gone into the White House. The use of the Espionage Act, now with Snowden 7 times, to shut down whistleblowers. I have friends who, I was an investigative reporter for the New York Times. I have friends who do investigative reporting, and they will tell you that at this point there is nobody within the national security apparatus, and this is being extended to every government agency, who will speak even on background because, of course, they're terrified of having this applied to them. The National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021, which permits the U.S. government to carry out, in essence, extraordinary rendition on American streets to seize U.S. citizens who, in the language of that section, substantially support. That is not a legal term. That is not material support. Substantially support Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces. Again, a nebulous phrase. Strip them of due process and hold them in military facilities until, in the language of this section, the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is forever. We won our case in the Southern District Court of New York. Judge Catherine Forrest and you should read her 112-page opinion on her ruling when she ruled this section unconstitutional, because it is an explication of the destruction of the separation of powers. She actually brings up the plight of the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were stripped of due process and interned during World War II in camps, and she says in her opinion correctly that in essence what this section of the NDAA does is allow the government to criminalize an entire group of people, which, let's be honest, is you and me, and the Occupy movement. The NDAA movement, the NDAA was passed, as far as I can tell, because finally the ruling elites who know both the effects of climate change and the deteriorating economy, they don't trust the police to protect them. And they want to be able to overturn 200 years of domestic law to bring the police back out into the streets, as we saw in Boston, as a kind of dress rehearsal after the Boston Marathon bombings. The NDAA is a piece of a broader picture. It fits with the persecution of Julian Assange, the persecution of Bradley Manning, the shutdown of whistleblowers, to create a system by which any kind of dissent is not only criminalized or made impossible. And what I find so frightening about the wholesale monitoring of the American public is that it becomes, in essence, the mechanism by which we can, or the power elite can build a wall around the activities that it is carrying out, and it can, because we are all being monitored, easily shut down anybody who tries to organize resistance against it, or anybody within the system who attempts to speak out, as Snowden did. And I think one of the reasons that Snowden not only left the country but went public was because he knew that they already had all of Glenn Greenwald's, the reporter for The Guardian who broke the story, they already had all of his communications and could very easily, would very easily and very quickly trace it directly to Snowden. We live in an age in which the formal mechanisms of power no longer work. The capacity to carry out incremental or piecemeal reform are broken. Barack Obama, like Nancy Pelosi, like anyone else in this town, Republican or Democrat, is a corporate employee. And what they argue about now is what Freud calls the narcissism of minor difference. The fact is that there is complete continuity between this administration and the last administration, not only in the expansion of our imperial war, and let's not forget that preemptive war is illegal under international law. It is defined as a criminal war of aggression. We have no right as a country to debate the terms of the occupation of Iraq or Afghanistan. It is complete continuity in terms of the assault on civil liberties. It is complete continuity in terms of the assault on the environment by the fossil fuel industry. And it exposes the truth that Karl Marx understood, and that is that unregulated, unfettered capitalism is a revolutionary force. Because it has no self-imposed limits, it commodifies everything. Human beings become commodities, and the natural world becomes a commodity, and then it exploits human beings and the natural world until exhaustion or collapse. This is not a new phenomenon in the twilight age of empire. And you can read great anthropologists like Redmond or Tainter's Collapse of Complex Societies to see how we fit the pattern. The difference is, this time when we go down, the whole planet is going to go down with us. And unless we are willing to put our bodies on the line, unless we are willing to walk out into the streets, unless we are willing to build a mass movement which defies all central forms of power, these corporate forces will quite literally kill us. Look at the summer Arctic sea ice, 40% melts, and companies like Shell look at the death throes of the planet as a business opportunity. In theological terms, we are fighting forces of death. And I have 4 children. And as a father, I know that we have betrayed that next generation. That generation will look back on us and ask, where were we? What did we do? Why did you do this to us? And even if I fail, I want my children to be able to say that their dad tried. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hedges. Before we hear from Professor West, I would like to introduce Emma Kate, who's our campaign organizer for the Bradley Manning Support Network. She has given us
Thank you all so much for being here today. So as Farah mentioned, I work with the Bradley Manning Support Network. Nathan and Farah and I all do. I've been with the network for almost 3 years now. This organization has been around since virtually Bradley's arrest in May of 2010. And from the very beginning, this has been a grassroots movement. Make no mistake. The Bradley Manning Support Network was formed when groups of veterans and anti-war activists and freedom of information activists and civil liberties activists, Americans who are paying attention and who want to stand up for not only our rights, but for the rights of people around the world, recognize the importance of this case and came together to form the network. And I see many of you in this room who've helped support our other events and our other efforts. So I just want to say a few words about what we've done and what we plan to do into the future. So the Bradley Manning Support Network, we fund 100% of Bradley Manning's legal fees. We also do public education and organizing. We organize events such as this. We were instrumental in the transfer of Bradley Manning from Quantico, where he was being held in solitary confinement, into medium security at Fort Leavenworth. Many people came together and protested and signed petitions, and his legal defense has acknowledged that was hugely helpful in improving his conditions in prison. On June 1st, 2 days before Bradley Manning's trial, we organized a protest with 1,000 people from all over the country who went out to Fort Meade, which is not easy to get to, and closed down several gates of base where Bradley's being tried. We've helped fill the courtroom every day of trial, and since last December, when the legal proceedings started, we've helped to, and when I say we, I'm including all of the volunteers who have been with us over the years. We've filled the courtroom, we've made sure there's always been coverage of these proceedings, even before we had transcripts. Nathan Fuller and others were there every day covering the proceedings. So it's in large part thanks to this network of people that we have been able to track what's happening with Bradley Manning's case over the past 3 years, and that we've been able to communicate that to the rest of the world. And we've watched the network grow. It started in the United States. We had an event in February where we had events across 5 continents. We had, I think, 70 events worldwide. So it's really quite impressive. And 500,000 people have signed a petition to improve Bradley's prison conditions. Recently, Amnesty International released a statement where they showed their support for Bradley Manning. They condemned the aiding enemy charge, but they also said that in many ways this is a case that is iconic of the growing national security state that has been using national security as an excuse to go around the world and do things with no accountability, virtually no accountability. But that is why Bradley Manning has so many supporters, because there are many people who recognize that the people who should be held accountable for crimes like torture, civilian casualties, the men who killed civilians in the collateral murder video, there have not been prosecutions for any of those crimes. Meanwhile, Bradley Manning is facing is facing life in prison. He's now facing 136 years. There's no minimum sentence, but there is large maximum, and he's facing a military tribunal that's going to decide his fate. And because we are not willing to let this military tribunal have the last word about Bradley Manning's fate, it's very important that our work continue. We will continue funding the legal defense through a potentially lengthy appeals process, both in military appeals courts and in federal appeals courts, protesting the use of the Espionage Act, which is unprecedented when it comes to convicting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. We'll also be mounting a large campaign for presidential pardon. And we'll be calling also upon the convening authority, General Buchanan, to use his authority to reduce Bradley's sentence. So it's very important that we continue to do our work and that as many people as possible stay involved in this case, which will set a huge precedent. Because Bradley Manning, obviously, if he goes to prison for a long time, it will put a chill on whistleblowers. But when people support him, you're also recognizing that Bradley Manning can be a beacon of hope. He shows people around the world that there are American soldiers with conscience. He also shows Americans how we can potentially use new technologies like the internet to take back our democracy and have more direct involvement. Those are the ideals he represents, and those are things that we think are important, that work continue. So, I'm asking you today to please help us continue our efforts. We're here to hear some great speakers, and that will continue. But we have two people who are going to be handing around baskets. And where are the baskets? All right, we have Deb over there, Leigh in the back. We're, again, a totally grassroots organization. It's people, thousands of people around the world that have allowed Bradley Manning to have a legal defense, that have allowed events like this to take place. So please donate to help us continue our work today if you can. There's also a young man with a clipboard. Where is he? Where is our clipboard? All right, Mike in the back there has the clipboard. We are heavily volunteer run. We could not do our work without volunteers. We will continue to have events like this and protests, and we need to continue to support Bradley while he's in prison. So please, if you're interested in following our efforts, sign up for our weekly newsletter and learn how else you can get involved. And finally, before I forget, I'll just say a word about questions. So we gave you all cards so that you can ask questions to these great speakers we have today. When you've written your question down, you can just stick the card up in the air, and Mike will collect that and hand it to me, and we'll get through as many questions as we can in the end. So thank you guys all very much for being here today and for caring about this important issue, and thank you again to all of our awesome speakers. And with that,
Professor Cornel.
What a blessing to be here. What an honor, what a privilege to be here to be in solidarity with our dear brother Bradley Manning. I'm looking for the money man. What's the money woman and the money man here? Just put it on the table. I want to salute each and every one of you for coming out on such a beautiful day to let Brother Manning know that we love him, we respect him, we will not forget him, and we're part of the same movement trying to tell the truth and promote justice that he is. And let the word go forth from here to Fort Meade. Thanks, Sister Emma, Sister Farrah, Brother Nathan, and my God, Brother Chris Hedges. He and I have been at it for decades now. We drove down early this morning. We're going back as soon as we finish, back to New Jersey, just as we did the first day of the Manning trial. Got up 3 o'clock in the morning, didn't we? Picked him up at his crib, and we were on our way to do the same thing we're doing now. And it has everything to do with the fundamental questions that the great W.B. Du Bois raised when he was 89 years old. At the very end of his life, he said, these are the queries I've been wrestling with. The first one is, how does integrity face oppression? He says, how does honesty face deception? How does decency face insult? How shall virtue face brute force? This is in his novel called The Ordeal of Manzar, 1957. He was born 1868. 89 years he's wrestling with these queries. 6 years before he began that trilogy, those 3 novels, he was in court, handcuffed, February 1951, for what? Aiding the enemy. The great W.E.B. Du Bois, aiding the enemy. No, he said, I'm wrestling with how can I preserve integrity, decency, honesty, a sense of virtue in such a cold and cruel world ruled by indifferent oligarchs and plutocrats who will go to any means for their gain, for their profit in the face of precious human beings, no matter what color, no matter what country, no matter what sexual orientation, or no matter what civilization. Oh yes, that's the tradition that we're talking about. That's why I'm glad to be in the Quaker house. Oh yes, I'm glad to be in the Quaker house. Those are my vanilla brothers and sisters. Even given whatever imperfections, they said, my life is going to be an exemplar of bearing some witness and telling some truth. And the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak. If you're not allowing suffering to speak, no matter what corner of the globe or neighborhood, then somehow you got a truncated conception of veracity. Oh yeah. That's why I call Brother Bradley Manning, as I do Brother Edward Snowden. Oh, they are the John Browns of our day. They are the John Browns of our day. And in the face of an escalating national security state and regiments, in the face of a massive surveillance state that represses, they want to exemplify some kind of integrity, decency, honesty. Virtue is not just an ideological or political question. It has to do with what kind of human being you're going to choose to be before the worms get you. Yep. That's the question that Brother Man is wrestling with. And can you imagine at 19 years old, in the military, the level of courage, fortitude, determination it takes to expose and uncover the crimes, the lies, the treachery, the chicanery of the U.S. government as it tells the world that we are the grand examples of liberty. Oh, yes. The man is no ordinary brother, but in many ways he's an extension of us at our best. And not just us, but an extension of the brothers and sisters in Latin America, in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Europe, in New York, in Chicago. Somebody who's willing to straighten their backs up, and anytime even one courageous person straightening their backs up, folk are going somewhere because the oligarchs can't ride your back unless it's bent. so long we've had so many bent backs, like our congressmen and women, like our president, like our vice president, like our secretary of state and secretary of defense. A lot of people accuse me and Brother Chris, oh, you're all obsessed with criticizing the president. No, not at all. We're trying to tell the truth. Wherever it falls, let it fall. No matter what color, no matter what class, no matter what sexual orientation, whose side are you on? That's the question. What are the lens through which you're looking at the world? Brother Bradley Manning says, I want to look at the world through the lens of those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. Du Bois said, I want to raise the issue of looking at the world through the angle of vision that has something to do with people who've been terrorized and traumatized and stigmatized for over 400 years. It may begin on the chocolate side of town. It may begin with 244 years of slavery when it was U.S. law. So for black humanity to assert ourselves as human beings, we had to break the law and reveal the hypocrisy of a nation that understood itself to be free and we are unfree, and it's your law. You can't but it's not just black people, it's poor people across the board, it's working people who had organized and sacrificed and lived and died just to ensure some slice of dignity, some slice of self-determination. It has to do with sisters of all colors in this vicious patriarchy. It has to do with our precious Jewish brothers and sisters and vicious anti-Semitism. It has to do with our precious Islamic and Arabic brothers and sisters with vicious forms of demonizing Islam and demonizing their sense of what it is to be human beings with religious sensibility. Oh yes, it has to do with our gay brothers and lesbian sisters and bisexuals and transgender. That's just not PC chit-chat. Oh no, that struggle on the ground with a moral substance and a spiritual contact to it. And that's precisely why the Bradley Manning moment is so crucial. It's against the backdrop of the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act. It's against the backdrop of Brother Trayvon Martin that wants to take us back to a Dred Scott mentality where black people have no right to even be respected, their lives to be lived are dead. No value even for a guilty Zimmerman. But you can't talk about Trayvon Martin unless you talk about Abdullah, the brother who was killed by a U.S. drone. There's a connection between George Zimmerman in Florida and U.S. drones dropping bombs on innocent, precious human beings in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Concerned about innocent folk everywhere. Everywhere. And that's the crucial thing. It could be innocent brothers and sisters in Tel Aviv, even given the vicious Israeli occupation. Jewish brothers and sisters in Tel Aviv still have oppressionism, and their innocent children ought not to be killed, even as they ought to set up to eliminate the occupation and allow the precious Palestinian brothers and sisters to live lives of dignity and self-determination. We have to be willing to tell the truth across the board. That's what Bradley Manning is all about. That's what it's all about. And what a grand moment it is, because there is an awakening taking place. There's no doubt about it. But the challenge is going to be, can we connect the military-industrial complex with its privatizing orientation, with big money caught in, with the prison industrial complex, with legacies of white supremacy still shot so deep across the nation, with the privatizing of our public educational system, and the gentrifying of our urban chocolate cities. And then keep track of the Wall Street oligarchic complex, with 1% of the population having now 43% of the wealth, and it increasing all the day, even as our precious, not just schools, but art programs in schools totally collapsing for our precious children in inner cities. What kind of future are we really talking about? That's the question that Bradley Manning raises, that connects us to him, what goes on in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan. And yes, even Russia too. We pray for Brother Edward Snowden. We're so glad. We're so glad that the Russian government, I'm so glad the Russian government gave him asylum. That's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful thing. We pray for your safety. But it won't stop me from talking about vicious Russian oligarchs. Or it won't stop me from talking about suppression of liberties and rights for other folk in Russia. Because I'm not in it for popularity. Like the boys, I just want to preserve some shiver, some slice of integrity, decency, honesty, and virtue before the worms get me, or before CIA and FBI. Either way. But that's what we're talking about. That's why we're here. Thank you all for being here. Stay strong and with us.
Thank you again for our great speakers, Mr. Hedges, Mr. West. Thank you so much. So this is a great opportunity to remind you once again, if you have an index card like this, and you have your question written on it, and you want to give it to Mr. McKee, who's right there, please do so now, as we are taking questions. And we shall begin with our Q&A portion right now. So, this question is for Mr. Hedges. Prosecutors tried to argue that Manning was working for a foreign intelligence agency, which was WikiLeaks. How damaging is this perspective, the future of his investigative journalism, of which WikiLeaks is part of?
Well, what they've tried to do, and unfortunately the traditional mainstream press has been complicit in this, is not recognize WikiLeaks as a publisher. This is quite frightening for those of us who care about exposing the inner workings of power, because it essentially allows the government to not only go after Manning, but go after the person who served as Manning's publisher, Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks, which of course, as those of you and most of you following the trial understand, much of the Manning trial is a setup for going after Julian Assange. What I find so naive on the part of the traditional press is that they somehow think the security and surveillance state is going to stop there. And there should have been enough of a wake-up call when it was exposed that 2 months of phone, email records were seized surreptitiously from the Associated Press by the government. We are now seeing the investigative reporter Jim Risen at the New York Times being called in and told that he has to expose his source over a story about torture and that may have been provided by one of the whistleblowers who's been charged under the Espionage Act. So again, this is part of a process, and the failure on the part of the traditional media to understand this process and this assault, not only against Manning, but against WikiLeaks, means that we are just seeing the noose tighten and tighten and tighten. And of course, the traditional press, which is becoming anemic, will be the last to go.
Question for Nathan Phillip. What is the legal precedent for sentencing in the Bradley Manning case?
For sentencing generally, or what was the question?
Yeah, and well, they also said in particularly, how does this Lawrence Franklin espionage case affect on Bradley Manning?
Well, I know that the use of the Espionage Act this way is unprecedented in that they secured a conviction for leaking to the press. They tried to do it with Thomas Drake, tried to do it with John Kiriakou. The Obama administration has used the Espionage Act in really unprecedented ways, using it to convict or attempt to convict more leakers than all previous presidents combined. And so this is a pretty systemic approach to chill that kind of getting information out to the press. Don't know the specific case of other espionage acts, but this is unprecedented as far as using it for leaks to the press.
The Espionage Act, which was written in 1917, is the equivalent of what the British would call the Foreign Secrets Act, whereby you give information to somebody defined as the enemy. Between 1917 and 2009, when Obama took office, it was used 3 times against whistleblowers, the first time being against Daniel Ellsberg when he leaked the Pentagon Papers. As Nathan said, Obama has now used it 7 times. And it has become the club, or the primary weapon, by which the security and surveillance state is now shutting down. But it is an utter perversion, an utter misuse of the Espionage Act, just as it has been perverted in the Bradley Manning trial. It was never written that way, it was never designed that way, but essentially it is being used now against us.
Professor West, how did your experience attending the Manning trial influence your perception of the fairness or the unfairness of the proceedings?
I didn't have high expectations. But I know all things are possible. And when we were there and had dialogues with Brother Michael Rattler and the others, talked to Brother Combs, is that his name, Brother David Combs? Yeah, the lawyer and so forth. I knew we had to fight. It was a David versus Goliath situation. But more importantly, the beautiful thing was to see the spirits and the minds and souls and bodies of all of the folk who were there. It's a beautiful thing to see. Camped out. And what was interesting was the press came from all around the world. 97% of the press was from outside the United States. This is what you call the willful blindness of the empire. That don't want to be exposed to the painful truths that cause them to question the lies that it tells about itself. And it's part of the massive captivity of the corporate media. The intimate, cozy relations between the corporate journalists and corporate elites and government. So that the legacies of I.F. Stone, even the Mencons, the Chris Hedges and Susan Sontags, and W.B. Du Bois's and T. Thomas Fortunes, and Ida B. Wells Barnett are pushed to the margins because those truths are too much of a threat. And just as a footnote on the Espionage Act, it's very important to keep in mind, because it was 16 months before things actually took off the war against Germany, but it was building. And it targeted the trade union movement. It targeted the Socialist Party. Debs went to jail. Victor Surge went to jail. The mayor of Oklahoma City, the mayor of Buffalo. Victor Berger was a congressman. He went to jail. Norman Thomas, the great Norman Thomas, marginalized, pushed him out of his church in East Harlem. Union Theological Seminary graduate in 1911. So I'm teaching there. But the targets, socialist, trade union, and emerging peoples of color against the war, as was the case of the great A. Philip Randolph, who was against the war. Now, unfortunately, Du Bois was for the war. Wrong, Du Bois. He's human like everybody else. He learned that lesson. That's all right. That's all right, Du Bois. You come on back. We love you. He was on the right track. He made a mistake. But that's important to keep in mind because the use of this act now keep in contact with who's being targeted. Why is there a $2 million bounty on Sister Assata Shakur? $2 million! I don't know. They've been in the country 40 years. She's a grandmother, 66 years old. Major threat to the national security of the United States. Given all of the white supremacist militia in America, you got 1,100 of them. You think maybe they're a little bit more of a threat than Sister Assata Shakur? If she's up on the top of the list, sending a message, sending a message. And our message to the White House is, you don't scare us at all. You don't intimidate us at all. We're not afraid. We refuse to be afraid. That's where we're coming from.
Mr. Hedges, do you believe political and economic reform are possible without Egyptian-style mass protest? If so, how do we rally the public to organize such protests?
It is not possible without mass protests. And that is, I think, why the Occupy threat, or what the Occupy movement was seen as such a threat and spooked and terrified the power elite the way it did. As I think the popular movement built around the defense of Bradley Manning spooks them. One of the advantages or disadvantages of having worked for as long as I did for the New York Times was that I walked within those circles of power. And I can tell you that the systems of power are far more fragile than they appear. Remember, I covered the revolution in East Germany, and the Stasi state was seen before its fall as an utterly monolithic, insurmountable force. And what happened is, and go back and read Havel's great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerlessness, that capacity that I think everyone in this room has to speak the truth to power frightens power, because power knows even better than we do that is the truth. So that when Erich Honecker, the dictator, 19 years in East Germany, sends down 70,000 paratroopers to fire on a crowd in Leipzig, the officers go into the barracks and they find the soldiers weeping on their beds. And they won't fire. And Honecker lasts another week in power. And I think that this system of power, one that has essentially surrendered to corporate greed and criminality, on the insides, these people know how vulnerable they are once that truth becomes known. And so something's coming. Paul Krugman writes about a rational response to the economy. He's right. But these people are incapable of carrying out a rational response. A rational response to what's happening to us would be a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of student debt, a health care system for all Americans. Capitalists should not be allowed anywhere near a health care system. We live in a country where it is legally permissible for corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughter, if that is not an utter moral perversion of the way to run a society. The more people who grasp the truth, the stronger we become. Remember, the Chicago Teachers Union had to fight Rahm Emanuel and the Democratic Party. And so all of my passion and all of my effort, and there are many people in this room who I know have put in long hours in this as well, is to build that movement to overthrow this system. Let me say that again if there are any Homeland Security. There's a word for that, and it's called revolution.
Most likely automatically will be just based on what prison sentence he's given. First it will go to Jeffrey Buchanan, who will review the case in its entirety, and I think there are several bases for appeal. I mean, this case was just rife with injustices throughout, not just the lack of media access, but what Bradley endured. 3 years without trial was nothing close to what our Constitution is supposed to promise in a speedy trial. Nearly a year in solitary confinement is obviously a pre-trial punishment intended to put fear in his heart, and it's a violation of the law, and it should be basis alone to overturn these convictions. If that's insufficient for General Buchanan, it'll go up to Army appeals courts, Armed Forces appeals courts, and hopefully we can continue to raise this issue. One of the main appeals arguments that was not really allowed in court is the fact that President Obama, Commander-in-Chief and therefore the superior of these military officials prosecuting, manning, and adjudicating his trial, declared him guilty in April 2011. That's a violation of the UCMJ and should be more than enough to overturn his conviction.
All right. This is a question for both Mr. Hedges and Mr. West. What is your take on the closing of the numerous U.S. embassies around the world? Do you think it's natural, or is it manufactured move by these countries?
Well, I mean, what's happened at a very fundamental level, and this began after 9/11, well, it really began after the First Gulf War, when we began to implant large military bases in Kuwait and throughout the Middle East. We now have satellite bases spread throughout the region. In essence, huge swaths of the Middle East are under American military occupation. And what the Muslim world is asking is essentially to be free from occupation. And there will be no respite from the conflict that we have created and we have engendered with the Muslim world until we leave. I covered Algeria, and when I would land at the airport, it would say, "Welcome to Algeria, land of 1 million martyrs." 1 million people died in the struggle to overthrow French colonialism. And just as we would, as a people, react if Iraqi APCs were going up and down the streets outside our windows and our family was being raided in the middle of the night by a bunch of people who didn't speak our language and terrorizing us. This is an utterly human and understandable reaction when you stand, as I did, in the Middle East. And so, unfortunately, especially since 9/11, we have essentially been sticking ourselves into the middle of a hornet's nest and prodding. We have been the best recruiting force for jihadists throughout the Middle East. And I think that there is a fundamental justice on the part of the Muslim world in terms of what they're fighting for and what they're asking for. And it isn't going to end until we as an empire learn to speak in another language besides the one of violence.
And I think it's very important to keep track of where the U.S. empire is actually expanding. They say they only have one base in Djibouti, in Africa. But there's been 12 new sites where drones take off and where drones land in Africa. in Africa. And so much of the shift is both to Asia on the one hand with the increasing possibility of war, and in Africa with the intensification of the conflict with the Chinese over not only the resources in Africa, but attempt to subjugate again and exploit again the resources and the precious brothers and sisters in Africa. So even the recent African trip was all about trade, but it didn't say a mumbling word about the bases and the new drone sites. Again, corporate media, embedded, no Socratic energy, no questioning, no critical scrutiny, just taking the PowerPoints of the government as if it was just about trade. Once again, American people rendered relatively blind in terms of what is going on in terms of these new sites, and we're going to see, I think, more and more bases. Very important. I hope you all do read the Black Agenda Report. Brother Glenn Ford, Bruce Dixon, Billy Bailey, Margaret Kimberly, and others. They keep track because there's some voices still around that's concerned about Africa, concerned about black folk, brown folk, red folk, massive treatment of what's going on with the hunger strikes in California, its connection to the hunger strikes in prison in Colombia. Oh, we got to stay in contact with what's happening here, but it's hard to get the news out. So when you read Counterpunch, read Truth Big, read Truth Out, read Chris Hedges, read Black Agenda Report. Of course, Sister Amy, we got to keep track of. Sister Amy, give Sister Amy a
parts for the whole panel. By sentencing Bradley Manning, is the government trying to scare whistleblowers? And the second part of this question, on the scale of from 0 to 10, being 10 the worst, where does the America's justice system stand? Nathan, do you want to go?
Yes.
So the first part was by sentencing Bradley Manning, is the government trying to scare whistleblowers?
They're certainly trying to. We saw with Edward Snowden that they're not going to be totally successful. But they're certainly trying to. We've heard the Guardian's investigating using the Iraq war logs to investigate torture in Iraq. General Petraeus is teaching Iraqi police how to torture the way we did, so we could turn it over and clean our hands of that. And in doing so, the Guardian spent 6 months trying to talk to soldiers who had inside information, who could provide that kind of detail. And they were afraid to. And for 6 months, American soldiers cited Bradley Manning's case to these Guardian reporters as reasons for they don't want to talk. They know these things are wrong. They know they deserve to be out in public, but they're too afraid to talk. And that's what the government wants. And too much, that's what they're getting. But hopefully we have more people inspired to take the risk and feel that it's worth it to make these abuses come to light.
Well, the judicial system is pretty anemic at best. Remember, it is both the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government that all signed off on the wholesale surveillance of the American public, essentially showing the collapse of the separation of powers. Every once in a while, you will find a judge, such as Catherine Forrest in the Southern District Court of New York, who ruled in our favor. The Obama administration, of course, appealed that decision, and unfortunately, the Second Circuit upheld or overturned Judge Forrest's decision to put, essentially create or legalize the use of Section 1021 of the NDA. We will appeal it again. But I think certainly at this point, most of the U.S. judiciary is a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state.
Yeah, I think for me, that's another way of saying that from the vantage point of poor and people of color in America, the criminal justice system is itself criminal. Yeah. What I mean by that is it has nearly destroyed 2 generations of poor black and brown brothers owing to a bogus war on drugs. Yeah. With an escalation of the prison industrial complex. The 13% of young black brothers and sisters involved in drug activity. 13% of vanilla brothers and sisters, drug activity. 65% of the convictions, black and brown. That's racist to the core, but it's classes too. Exactly. It has to do with the poor folk. How many Wall Street executives have gone to jail owing to massive criminality, insider trading, market manipulation, fraudulent accounting? We go on and on. Not one. Not one. And in addition, I think the other side of this to keep in mind is that it's part of the history. And this is again why Trayvon Martin moment is so important. It's part of the history. You see, for 244 years of slavery and 80-some years of the U.S. Republic, the Constitution, a pro-slavery document in practice. So in the name of the law, morality is suspended when it comes to black people. And that's been true for Jim Crow. It's true for Jim Crow. And the new Jim Crow is an extension of that same tradition, but it primarily affects black poor and brown poor. So a black middle class leadership detached from the plight of the poor finds itself capitulating to imperial elites in the White House, though black, refusing to highlight the plight of these precious poor folk whose legacy has been about as criminals we can think. Crimes against humanity every generation. So when we look at the criminal justice system, what's the vantage point? Now, of course, we were just there with Mumia Abu-Jamal. I know Brother Tim Hicks, Cornel West Theory, got Mumia Abu-Jamal on the next album, right? There with Jim Crow. The political prisoners still there. You got Sandiata and a whole host of others. They're still there.
Marshall Eddie Conway.
Absolutely, just call the roll. Leonard, we go on and on. We go on and on. And it's not just black, but it's disproportionately black. Why? Because in the end, we have to be very honest about this. And this is why the coming together is so important. And this is why the powers that be do become more threatened when they see black, white, and red, and yellow, and Asian, indigenous peoples coming together. Oh, when we start coming together around issues of trust and truth and justice, then we got a major threat. And that's precisely the threat that we need more of.
Since President Obama's time in office is still running, has he ever commuted or excused any prisoner? And would Bradley Manning be the first? And I think this is a question for all the panelists.
I think that's an empirical question. I think he pardoned it. But you would not do it.
Hardly use it at all.
Hardly use it at all. Yeah.
Power to it. We'd rather be
Yeah, you were just saying, you know, if Larry Summers went to jail, he would be pardoned. Let's put it that way. Tim Geithner went to jail, he would be pardoned. Oh yeah, those are his friends.
Well, what would it take President Obama to keep his promise to protect whistleblowers, and would that be an opportunity to pardon Bradley Manning?
If you haven't figured out Obama by now, he's not working for us. He's working for ExxonMobil, Citibank, Goldman Sachs. There is no way within the American political system to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. And Obama, unlike his predecessor, who was an idiot, Obama knows who he's working for. And I find him pretty cynical. Bush was pretty clueless. And not only that, Obama's a constitutional lawyer. He knows that the laws he are passing are shredding our most important and basic constitutional liberties. So these appeals to Obama, I find a kind of frightening form of self-delusion.
One final reminder about your questions. If you still have your question index card in your hand and you haven't given it to Mike McKee, please go ahead and do so. So we can read your lovely questions and continue with this wonderful conversation. Now, the government has spent a lot of money on chasing Edward Snowden and obviously on Bradley Manning's case. Do you think that the government has given up on the freedom of information for the people? There is no democracy, no transparent democracy anymore, and what does the future of a transparent democracy look like in America?
I think so much depends on what we do. The government's going to do what it can if it can get away with it. That's what power does in high places. That's how wickedness operates in high places. And if we don't put any pressure on them, we don't stay in the streets, raise our voices, go to jail, make our loving threats. And I'm a Christian, so it's got to be love in it. It's not about hatred and revenge. It's about justice. It's about fairness. We're going to keep it on the spiritual and moral plane. But that doesn't mean you don't fight. Right. We have to become warriors and soldiers committed to tenderness, gentleness, sweetness, justice, and freedom.
We were talking in the car down from Princeton about Howard Zinn, who we both admire immensely. And I teach in a prison, and when you write a course description, you write it for the prison authority, so it's the opposite of writing for a college catalog. You're trying to write something that is as bland and uncontroversial as possible. So I submitted a proposal to teach the prisoners about our wonderful heritage of American history and the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. And as soon as it was approved, I went out and bought every prisoner a copy of the People's History. Zinn is important because, as that book illustrates, the American system was created as a closed system by an oligarchic white male slave-holding class. And they created mechanisms by which direct or popular democracy would be impossible. Through electoral college, through the appointment of senators, and through the disenfranchisement of most of the population, African Americans, Native Americans, women, and males without property. There you go, Washington, D.C. And so, as Zinn points out, all of the correctives to American democracy came through movements that never achieved formal positions of power. The abolitionists that fought slavery, the suffragists that fought for women's rights, the labor movement, and the civil rights movement. And you could say that until he was assassinated in April of 1968, the most powerful political figure in America was Martin Luther King. Because when he went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. Yes. And that is what we have to create. The failure of the left is that we forgot. It is not our job to take power. It is our job to make power frightened of us. We will only do that by holding fast to moral imperatives. So, it's 1971. It's a description from Kissinger's memoirs. Do not buy the book. The White House is surrounded by anti-war demonstrators. Nixon has taken empty city buses and put them end to end as a kind of barricade, and he's standing before the window, wringing his hands, going, "Henry, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us," and that is where we want people in power.
I think I want to register a disagreement here in terms of power. I mean, one, there's different kinds of power. See, poor people always have spiritual power. That's why it's the culture of poor people that dominates the money-making entertainment industry. And I'm not just talking about hip-hop. Frank Sinatra was working-class Italian, Hoboken, Jersey, in love with a genius from Baltimore City named Billie Holiday. It's from below that spiritual and cultural power come. Curtis Mayfield and John Coltrane, they come from the poor side of town, but their genius and their talent is so overwhelming that people want to gain access to their spiritual and their cultural power. The question is, how do you translate that power into some kind of political and economic power? So I agree with you in terms of we must constitute a threat to the powers that be, but we already have certain kinds of powers, and I think in the end we have to have some kind of political and economic power that we have in control. We just want to make sure that they are accountable to poor and working people who historically have given the world some of the greatest spirit and culture that the human species have known. So you see where I'm going on that? Would you agree with that or what?
Yeah. Although I would say that the last liberal president we had was Nixon. Because Nixon was frightened of movements. And that, you take the political configuration of Germany. The Labour Party never polls more than 5%. But because Labour holds fast around that party and those ideals, it creates a kind of pressure by which it influences. This is what Debs did. Roosevelt was a conciliatory figure. I mean, Roosevelt says that his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism, and that's right. And the programs of the New Deal came out of the Progressive Party, the Communist Party, the radical labor unions, the old CIO, and I think that it's important that we recapture those movements that were quite intentionally destroyed in the name of the war on communism. And now, of course, we have the war on terror. Yeah. It's the same paradigm, the same method. I agree totally with what you're saying, but I think that at the same time, the failure is that we have invested ourselves into political entities like the Democratic Party that speak that traditional feel-your-pain language of liberalism and yet betray the very people that they purport to represent.
the power of the people and its deep impact and influence on the authority. How could we mobilize the power of the people to ensure the protection of whistleblowers and potentially free Bradley Manning? Any ways, any tactics, any strategies?
I think it's taking place. This is part of what this gathering is all about. But there's so many wonderful citizens who are doing various kind of things on the local and state and regional level. We don't want to become obsessed with just the national level. Just because we don't see national organizations of progressive power, don't think they're not people on the ground who are doing wonderful things against overwhelming odds. And there's so many different issues. We talked about climate change. We talked about global domination of the planet. But you also got to talk about the new immigrants. You got to talk about the immigration crisis at the border, the wall. You got to talk about defending the rights of Muslims, defending the rights of Arabs. For a while, that became the substitute for the communists before terrorism kicked in. Du Bois was characterized as a victim of the war against communism. Bradley Manning, the war against terrorism. In between, there was a war against our Muslim brothers and sisters and our Arab brothers and sisters. But we also got the trade union movement in deep crisis that needs fundamental support. And the same is true in sexual orientation. So we've got a number of issues. The problem is, how do we somehow bring people together without people feeling as if somehow their issue has been overlooked and downplayed? And that's part of the challenge. We don't yet have a formula. We don't yet have a mechanism institutionally or ideologically to pull that off. And it might be the case that we just end up pushed to the wall in a corner together anyway, as the powers that be become more schizophrenic and paranoid.
Public school teachers.
Public school, that's part of the trade union movement for me, but especially that slice, given the demonization. And of course, so much of that has to do with the legacy of white supremacy too, because you're talking about schools where children are disproportionately black, disproportionately brown, disproportionately poor, and the teachers are disproportionately black and brown. And then come the privateers, here come the free marketeers coming in, salivating, wanting big profit. Absolutely, but DC is the major side of this, but Chicago, oh Lord have mercy too. New York, we struggling in Harlem. The same challenge, but DC, of course. I mean, good.
You're here now.
I'm right here now in DC, absolutely. I'll bring you my sister.
We have 10 minutes left, and we have a great amount of questions, but I hope that you managed to answer most of people's questions and ideas. I have a question that I want to ask each and every one of you. If you are in a room with Bradley Manning right now, or if Bradley Manning was with us right now, and hopefully he will be, what would you want to tell him?
Give him a hug. I said, brother, you're taking a great stand. Taking a great stand, then I would say, is there a way of escaping from this place? Let's see what the possibilities are. But most importantly, I would try to accent him as this grand enactor of these very, very basic values, which for me is the raw stuff, because we live in an age of monstrous mendacity and hyper-hypocrisy and just ubiquitous criminality. And in such a moment, just telling the truth is revolutionary. Being honest is revolutionary. Having virtue is revolutionary. Because most people obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. And you say, no, Bradley Manning represents decency and that honesty. And I would say, thank you, brother.
Yes.
The ancestors at their best of all colors, thank you, brother.
Yes.
You put a smile on your parents' face. You put a smile on John Brown's face. You put a smile on Dorothy Day's face. You put a smile on Edward Zayed. You put a smile on Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Martin King smiling on you, brother. I want you to know that. And their smile is much weightier than all of the demonizing and all of the lies coming your way from those with truncated moral sensibility.
Yes.
Try and compete with that. Yeah, that's it. I mean, he comes out of a long tradition, and as I said at the beginning, he has chosen to live the righteous life, and the Bible is nothing if not, deeply prescient about the cost of righteousness, which is persecution and at times even death.
Yeah.
And Manning has stood up, and decided that living the moral life, even in the face of monstrous power, is an affirmation of himself as a human being. And for that, he is not only deeply courageous and a kind of example to all of us, but finally deeply inspiring.
can't say much better than that, but I would certainly have to thank him. I know that soldiers are taught to, they have to do their jobs, they have to kind of disregard human life. They have to see others as the other, as less than themselves. And for Bradley to refuse to do that is just incredibly inspiring, and that's why I come here and support him every day.
Invite Emma back again. She also has one final announcement to give. So, Emma.
Thank you. So just a couple of things. I want to let people know that if you're interested in attending the trial, it's going through late August. You can be in the room with Bradley Manning. You can see what's really going on, what the military is really doing, and you can be there, show him and his attorney your support. And if you're interested in getting more information about how you can do that, where he's being tried in Maryland, there's a sign-up sheet on the table right over there. And I also wanted to read you a message from Bradley's family. Bradley's family, his mother and his aunt, live in Wales. They've recently started talking more to the media. I actually read a long article this morning where Bradley's aunt talked about how she traveled all the way from Wales out to Kansas to see Bradley, and how the soldiers kept her waiting so that she only saw him for 40 minutes after coming all the way from Wales. And she asked him, and she said, "Bradley, is there anything we can do for you? Anything at all you need?" And he pointed to his head, and he pointed to his heart, and he said, "This is all I need. Thank you." And so his family published a thank you letter on his behalf to all the people who've been doing work to support him over the years in his righteous pursuit of the truth and justice. They said, "We want to express our deep thanks to David Coombs, who has dedicated 3 years of his life to serving as lead counsel in Brad's case." And they go on to thank the whole legal defense. And they say that most of all, we would like to thank the thousands of people who rallied to Brad's cause, providing financial and emotional support throughout his long and difficult time, especially Courage to Resist and the Bradley Manning Support Network. Your support has allowed a young Army private to defend himself against the full might of not only the U.S. Army, but also the U.S. government. So thank you guys for being here. Thank you for making this possible. Thank you to our speakers, and I hope that you'll stay involved and stay in touch, and that we can see you at our events in the future. Thank you.
Bradley Manning. Free Bradley Manning. Free Bradley. Bradley Manning. Free 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 Bradley Manning.
Thank you again, and please do attend the court. Come see Bradley. It's a great experience, and it means a lot to him, and it will mean a lot to you. Thank you.